Sarah Mitchell's fingers trembled as she gripped the notice's third and final warning, red ink bleeding across cheap paper like an accusation. 3 months overdue. The landlord's patience had run dry 2 weeks ago, and now the electricity had joined the water in silent protest against their continued existence in the cramped room that smelled of mildew and yesterday's desperation. Lily's quiet sobs drifted from the corner where the 8-year-old had curled herself into the smallest possible shape, as if disappearing might solve what her mother could not. Marcus sat rigid on the edge of the stained mattress. They all shared his 12-year-old shoulders, carrying weight no child should know. Evan, barely 6, pressed his face against the window, watching other children play in the apartment complex courtyard. Children whose mothers hadn't lost everything when their fathers died in construction accidents, that paid no compensation, offered no apologies, left no safety net beyond the gaping hole where a future used to be. The phone, a prepaid burner Sarah kept for emergencies, and the occasional cleaning job buzzed against the table. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Bill collectors had learned her habits, timing their calls for maximum psychological impact. But something made her thumb hover over the green button, some animal instinct that recognized the edge of a cliff and wondered what lay beyond the falling. The voice on the other end spoke with the measured formality of someone accustomed to delivering news that changed lives, though whether for better or worse remained to be seen until all the words had landed. Harrison, attorney at law representing the estate of one Elizabeth Coleman, recently deceased, matter requiring immediate attention. Could she come to his office tomorrow at 10? Sarah's throat constricted. She knew no one named Elizabeth Coleman. James had died 2 years ago with nothing but debts and the lingering scent of sawdust on work clothes she still couldn't bring herself to wash. His father, George, had passed before they'd even met, and James had spoken of his mother only in the past tense, a woman who'd abandoned him at 5 years old, too poor and selfish to fight for custody, too interested in her own survival to care about the son she'd left behind. Tomorrow at 10. Sarah looked at the eviction notice again. Tomorrow the landlord's brother would change the locks while they hauled their meager possessions to where exactly the shelter had a 3-week waiting list. Her sister in Ohio had made it clear that charity stopped at blood relations who brought problems instead of solutions. Tomorrow at 10 might be the last appointment she could keep before addresses became irrelevant and mailboxes became someone else's concern. Marcus shifted, and the mattress springs sang their familiar song of slow surrender. His voice emerged, careful, older than its years deserved to be. What did they want? Sarah turned the phone over in her hands, studying the black screen as if it might reveal truths she couldn't yet see. Someone died and left us something. Maybe. Who? I don't know. The silence that followed carried the weight of 2 years' worth of maybes. Maybe the insurance would come through. Maybe the union would help. Maybe someone would hire a widow with 3 kids and gaps in her work history that screamed unreliable. Maybe tomorrow would be different from today. Maybe had become a 4-letter word that tasted like ash and sounded like lies. Morning arrived with the indifference of all mornings, neither early nor late, simply inevitable. Sarah dressed the children in their cleanest clothes, Marcus in the button-down shirt from his father's funeral, Lily in the flower print dress that had fit perfectly last summer and now pulled tight across growing shoulders, Evan in hand-me-downs that swallowed his small frame whole. The bus ride to downtown took 40 minutes and cost $3.50 each way, $7 that might have been 2 meals if she stretched them far enough. Watered the soup, thin enough pretended fullness was a choice rather than a necessity. Harrison's office occupied the 2nd floor of a building that had seen better decades but still maintained enough dignity to require wiping your feet before entering. The waiting room smelled of old paper and furniture polish, leather chairs that creaked when you sat, and magazines from 6 months ago offering advice on problems Sarah couldn't afford to have. The receptionist's middle-aged wedding ring that caught the light, reading glasses on a chain, smiled with the kind of practiced warmth that came from years of ushering strangers through other people's deaths. They didn't wait long. Harrison himself emerged, 50s, maybe gray at the temples, in a way that suggested distinction rather than age, suit pressed and tie straight, everything about him speaking of order in a world Sarah had learned was fundamentally chaotic. His handshake was firm, without crushing, and he met her eyes with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. She'd stopped being able to tell the difference. The office beyond held more leather, more wood, more evidence of stability that felt alien as a foreign country. Harrison gestured to the chairs across from his desk, waited until they'd settled before opening a file that looked too thick for a simple inheritance, too detailed for a stranger's generosity. Mrs. Mitchell, I'll be direct because I suspect your time is valuable and your patience for legal niceties is limited. Sarah appreciated that more than he could know. She nodded. Elizabeth Coleman passed away 3 months ago. You are named as the sole beneficiary of her estate. The words landed and bounced off meaningless syllables in a sequence that refused to form coherent understanding. I don't know anyone by that name. Harrison pulled a photograph from the file, slid it across the polished desk. A woman, perhaps 70, silver hair, cut short, eyes that held the camera with steady defiance. Unfamiliar. Completely, utterly unknown. She was the biological mother of your late husband, James Mitchell. The air in the room shifted, pressure changing in ways Sarah's ears registered, but her brain struggled to process. James's mother had abandoned him, left when he was 5. Never looked back, never reached out, never cared enough to. That's impossible. James said she wanted nothing to do with him. Harrison's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he'd expected this response, had prepared for it, the way lawyers were prepared for every contingency. He withdrew more photographs, spreading them across the desk like evidence in a trial Sarah hadn't known she was attending. James at 10, maybe 11, standing in front of a house Sarah didn't recognize. James at his high school graduation cap, askew, grin wide. James and Sarah on their wedding day, the photograph taken from behind and to the left, distant enough to be unnoticed, close enough to capture the moment he'd turned to kiss her. Marcus as a baby, chubby fists raised toward a sky full of clouds. Lily learning to walk, arms outstretched, face bright with discovery. Evan last autumn throwing leaves in the park near their old apartment, the one they'd lost 6 months after James died, when the single income couldn't stretch far enough to cover what two had barely managed. Every photograph taken from a distance, every moment captured by someone who'd been watching, following, documenting a life she supposedly wanted no part of. Sarah's hands went cold, fingers numb against the glossy photo paper. Who took these? Mrs. Coleman employed various individuals over the years to photograph your family. She has had albums, dozens of them. Every birthday, every school play, every ordinary Tuesday that she couldn't be present for, but refused to miss entirely. Marcus leaned forward, his young face tight with confusion that bordered on anger. She was stalking us. She was loving you from a distance she believed was necessary for your safety. The words hung there, inadequate and enormous all at once. Sarah forced her brain past the shock, past the violation of being observed unknowingly, toward the practical questions that mattered in a world where sentiment didn't pay rent. What exactly did she leave us? Harrison withdrew another document, this one official and stamped and bearing the weight of legal truth. A property in Pinewood County, approximately 90 miles from here. The house is, he paused, choosing words carefully, in significant disrepair. Additionally, 2 parcels of undeveloped land adjacent to the main property, and a bank account specifically designated for restoration and improvements. Sarah's pulse quickened despite her better judgment. Property meant shelter, maybe, or at least leverage for something better than an eviction notice written in red ink. How much is in the account? $50,000. The number ricocheted through her skull, too large to be real, too specific to be a mistake. $50,000. That was food for a year, rent for 3 years, college funds, and doctor visits, and shoes that fit, and nights where she didn't lie awake calculating which bill could go unpaid without immediate catastrophe. That was breathing room. That was possibility. There must be conditions. Harrison nodded, the gesture confirming what Sarah's experience had already taught her. Nothing came without cost. No gift arrived without strings, especially not for people like her, who'd learned to expect the universe's generosity came with fine print, designed to crush hope before it fully formed. You must reside at the property for a minimum of 12 consecutive months. Absence cannot exceed 3 days per month. Failure to meet these requirements results in forfeiture of the entire estate. Forfeiture to whom? Richard Coleman, Mrs. Coleman's younger brother. He's already filed a legal challenge to the will, claiming you're not entitled to inherit given your lack of blood relation or prior relationship with the deceased. Of course someone would contest it. Sarah had briefly entertained the fantasy of simple generosity, straightforward redemption, the universe deciding she'd suffered enough and offering reprieve. Foolish. The universe didn't work that way, and she knew better than to forget it, even temporarily. When does the 12 months start? Upon your acceptance of the inheritance and first night of residence on the property. In this Richard Coleman's lawsuit, preliminary hearing in 45 days. You'll need to demonstrate legitimate residence by that time, show intent to fulfill the will's requirements. Sarah looked at her children. Marcus met her gaze with the steadiness he'd learned from watching his father work through pain, watching his mother scrub floors until her knees bled, watching the world break promises and keep going anyway. Lily had stopped crying, her attention fixed on the photographs of herself as a toddler, trying to reconcile the distant observer with the grandmother concept that should have meant warmth and cookies instead of telephoto lenses and albums full of stolen moments. Evan pressed against Sarah's side, small and trusting in ways that simultaneously broke her heart and steeled her resolve. 90 miles, 12 months, $50,000, and a property in serious disrepair, whatever that meant. Probably everything from mild neglect to structural condemnation, knowing how these things typically went for people whose luck ran the way hers did. But it was something. It was more than nothing. It was more than the eviction notice, an empty refrigerator, and nights where she divided dinner into 3 portions and pretended she'd already eaten. I'd like to see the property. Harrison's approval was subtle but present, a slight relaxation around his eyes that suggested he'd hoped she'd say exactly that. I can arrange transportation. This afternoon if you're available. Sarah almost laughed. Available. As if her calendar overflowed with pressing engagements, crucial appointments, social obligations that demanded her immediate attention. She had nothing but time and desperation, and Harrison surely knew it, even if politeness required pretending otherwise. The vehicle that arrived 3 hours later was neither new nor particularly well maintained. A pickup truck driven by a man who introduced himself simply as Garrett, lean and weathered late 50s perhaps, with hands that knew work and eyes that had seen enough to recognize trouble, when it walked toward him wearing a determined expression and dragging 3 exhausted children behind it. He drove with the casual competence of someone who'd navigated these back roads 10,000 times, knew where the potholes hid and which curves came faster than they looked, and when to slow down, even though the road appeared clear because deer didn't respect schedules or human convenience. They left pavement behind after 20 minutes, traded asphalt for dirt that rattled the truck's suspension and coated the windows with fine dust that turned the afternoon sun amber and strange. Trees crowded closer, pine and oak, and something Sarah couldn't name, branches, forming a canopy that swallowed the sky and made the truck's interior feel smaller, more confined, like descending into somewhere the light had forgotten existed. Mrs. Coleman was a private woman. Garrett offered the first words he'd spoken since they'd left the city limits behind. Lived out here alone for near about 30 years. Folks in town knew her enough to nod hello, but nobody knew her well enough to call friend, if you understand my meaning. Sarah understood. She'd become that kind of private herself since James died, the kind that answered greetings but discouraged follow-up questions, that smiled in ways designed to prevent further conversation, that built walls not from unfriendliness, but from the exhaustion of explaining circumstances that invited pity or judgment or well-meaning advice that assumed problems had solutions if you just tried hard enough. The trees thinned. The road, if it deserved that title, narrowed further, little more than 2 tire tracks with grass growing between them. And then the truck slowed, stopped, and Garrett's face did something complicated that might have been sympathy or might have been resignation. That's it then. Sarah followed his gaze through the windshield, and her stomach dropped with the sick weight of hope dashed hard against reality's jagged edges. This wasn't disrepair. This was demolition arrested midway, neglect weaponized against structure until structure lost the war and surrendered to gravity and time and the fundamental entropy that claimed all things eventually. The house, she used the term loosely, sagged like something dying in stages. Roof collapsed across what might have once been a main room, walls buckled and black with rot, where water had won its patient campaign against wood and will. Windows gaped empty, glass long gone to weather, or vandals, or simple surrender frames twisted at angles that suggested violence. The whole thing leaned east as if trying to escape its foundation, trying to crawl away from whatever history had happened here, and left it this ruined. Marcus's voice emerged small and tight. This is supposed to be our house. Sarah had no answer that wouldn't sound like a lie or an apology, and she'd promised herself when James died that she wouldn't lie to her children about the world's fundamental unfairness, wouldn't apologize for circumstances beyond her control. Sometimes all you could offer was silence that acknowledged the truth without trying to soften it. Garrett cleared his throat. Mrs. Coleman's place was a ways past this. This here's the original homestead, been abandoned near 40 years from what I heard. Your property starts at that oak yonder. He pointed to a massive tree whose trunk could have hidden a grown man, branches spreading wide enough to shade half an acre, and runs about 15 acres total, including the collapsed structure. Good land, though. Rich soil, spring-fed creek at the back. Worth something if you're willing to work it. If, the smallest word carrying the heaviest weight, If you're willing to work land you don't know how to farm, if you're willing to live somewhere electricity hasn't reached and running water means what flows in the creek, if you're willing to bet everything on a dead woman's generosity and a lawyer's assurances and the fundamental belief that 12 months of hell might purchase a future marginally less hellish than the present. Sarah opened the truck door. The air outside smelled of pine sap and earth and something else, smoke old and faded, but present like fire had visited here and left its signature burned into memory. Her feet found uneven ground, grass tall enough to hide snakes if snakes lived this far north, if snakes cared about property lines and inheritance disputes and widows who'd run out of better options. Y'all stay in the truck. She directed this at the children, saw Marcus's protest forming, and cut it off with a look that brooked no argument. This wasn't a democracy. This was survival. And survival meant the adult went first to check for dangers the children shouldn't face until absolutely necessary. The grass whispered against her jeans as she approached the ruin. Up close, the damage revealed itself in greater detail, charring along the south wall that spoke of fire attempted, if not completed, door hanging by one hinge and beaten inward as if someone had fled rather than entered. Foundation cracked and sinking on the left, where the ground had shifted or simply given up supporting weight it had carried for however many decades before deciding enough was enough. Every surface wore the gray patina of abandonment, that particular shade of weathered hopelessness that came from years without human touch, without care, without anyone believing the structure worth saving. Sarah circled slowly, picking her way over fallen timbers and scattered debris, beer cans, suggesting teenagers had used this place for parties, cigarette butts, a condom wrapper that made her stomach turn thinking about what else might have happened here in the dark. She almost missed it, almost walked right past the disturbed earth near what had been the back corner where someone had dug recently, no grass, growing yet soil still dark and loose, shaped in a rectangle, maybe 3 feet by 2 feet. Fresh. Within the last few days, if she had to guess though, her expertise in dirt dating was limited at best. Her pulse picked up for reasons she couldn't immediately name. Someone had been here. Someone had dug here, specifically here near this specific corner of this abandoned structure that shouldn't matter to anyone. She crouched, brushed soil aside with hands that knew cleaning other people's dirt but not excavating secrets. Her fingers found metal, cool and smooth and definitely intentional, definitely placed rather than naturally occurring. The box was small, maybe the size of a hardback book, sealed with a simple latch that yielded when she applied pressure. Inside, chaos organized. A key stamped with numbers, 237 bank logo. She didn't recognize. Papers folded in careful deed registrations that mentioned acreage and coordinates and legal descriptions that meant nothing to someone who'd never owned property before. A map hand-drawn in blue ink on what looked like graph paper marking 4 locations with X's and notations in cramped handwriting that suggested either age or urgency. A photograph old and creased showing a younger Elizabeth Coleman. Sarah recognized her from the lawyer's office, standing beside a man whose bulk and scowl suggested mean, the way some people's faces just did. Elizabeth's smile looked wrong painted on, and her left eye carried the yellowing remnant of a bruise someone had tried and failed to fully conceal with makeup. And a letter, single-page handwritten, dated 3 months ago. Sarah, if you are reading this, you survived the first test, not giving up when hope looked like mockery. Good. You'll need that stubbornness for what comes next. There are 6 more envelopes hidden on this land. Each contains a piece of the truth about your husband's family, about my choices, about why I left James when he needed me most. Find them. Read them. Understand that love sometimes requires distance, that protection sometimes looks like abandonment, that I never stopped watching, even when I had to stop touching. But hurry. Someone else knows about this. Land knows what it holds, knows the value buried here goes beyond sentiment. Richard will do anything to take what I left for you and the children. Anything. I chose you because I watched you survive what would have broken lesser women. I chose you because James chose you, and my son had good judgment about hearts, even if the world gave him nothing else worth trusting. Trust Garrett. Trust Helen Wright in town. Trust no one named Coleman except Victoria, and even her trust carefully. The children deserve better than I could give James. You deserve the chance I never had. Take it. Fight for it. Don't let Richard's money and lawyers convince you that the law favors the powerful over the deserving. With love you never knew existed. Elizabeth. Sarah read it twice, then a third time, trying to parse meaning from words that raised more questions than they answered. 6 more envelopes. Someone else searching. Richard Coleman, the brother who'd already filed suit, apparently willing to do anything. The word choice felt deliberate, ominous to claim this land for himself. Why, what value could 15 acres of trees and collapsed structures hold that justified legal battles and what sounded like threats? A sound behind her footsteps through grass too heavy for the children. Sarah spun hard-hammering and found Marcus standing 5 feet away looking guilty and defiant in equal measure. You said stay in the truck. You were gone too long. I got worried. Fair enough. Sarah couldn't exactly argue when his concern came from the same place hers did, the knowledge that the world took people away without warning, that sometimes gone meant gone. That worry was rational in a universe that had already proven its willingness to destroy what you loved most. She held up the letter. Read this. Marcus took it, his young face serious as he scanned the lines. His eyes widened at certain phrases, anything Richard valued buried here. And Sarah watched him age in real time the way children did when forced to confront adult complexities before they should have to. When he finished, he looked up with something that might have been fear or might have been excitement, and might have been the exact combination of both that defined life on the edge between disaster and possibility. What does she mean, value buried here? I don't know. Are we going to stay? The question demanded an answer Sarah didn't have, not fully formed, not thought through to its logical conclusions and potential consequences. They had nowhere else to go. The eviction wasn't a maybe anymore, wasn't a threat to be negotiated or delayed. Tomorrow or the day after, their possessions would line the sidewalk and the locks would change, and that chapter would close whether she was ready or not. This land offered shelter of a sort, even if that shelter looked more like exposure with trees around it. The $50,000 could buy materials, could hire workers to make something habitable from the nothing currently standing. 12 months. 1 year to prove they deserved what a dead woman had chosen to give them. But the letter's warning echoed someone else, searching Richard, willing to do anything value that required hurrying before unnamed others found whatever Elizabeth had hidden. That sounded like danger. That sounded like the kind of situation single mothers with 3 young children should run from, not toward. Except running required somewhere to run to, and Sarah's options had narrowed to this gamble on a dead woman's generosity and a property that might kill them or might save them, or gamble on the shelter system and government assistance and the fundamental goodwill of strangers who owed her nothing and had their own problems that didn't leave room for hers. Some choices weren't really choices at all. Some decisions made themselves when every alternative had already been eliminated by circumstances beyond your control. Sarah folded the letter, tucked it and the other contents back into the metal box, closed the lid carefully. Marcus watched her with James's eyes brown and steady, and too aware of harsh truths, waiting for the verdict that would determine whether they fought or fled. We're staying. The words emerged with more confidence than she felt, but that was parenthood in a sentence, projecting certainty you didn't possess, because the alternative was admitting you were navigating blind and hoping luck favored the desperate. Marcus nodded slowly, accepting the decision the way he accepted most things now, with the resignation of someone who understood that control was an illusion and influence was the best anyone could really hope for. They walked back to the truck together. Lily looked up as they approached, her face hopeful in ways that hurt to see, but still young enough to believe adults had answers, that mothers could fix things, that saying they were staying meant they'd found something worth staying for rather than simply running out of ways to leave. Garrett's expression suggested he'd watched this scene play out before, maybe not with Sarah specifically, but with people like her, people who'd been backed into corners where desperation looked like opportunity if you squinted hard enough and ignored the warning signs screaming run. You'll need supplies, tent, camping gear, water purification. Can't live in that wreck, and buildings are going to take time you might not have before winter. Sarah mentally calculated the cash she had left, $43 and change, enough for maybe a week of food if she stretched it, certainly not enough for camping equipment and whatever else survival on undeveloped land required. But Harrison had mentioned the $50,000, and presumably she could access some portion of that for immediate needs, basic materials that meant the difference between camping and dying of exposure. Can you take us back to town? I need to talk to Mr. Harrison about accessing the inheritance account. Garrett nodded, started the engine, turned the truck in a careful arc that avoided the worst ruts, and brought them back onto the dirt track that passed for a road. The drive back felt different than the drive out, shorter, somehow compressed by knowledge that forward momentum had been replaced with circular inevitability. This was happening. This was real. In 48 hours, maybe less, Sarah would be sleeping under canvas on land she didn't understand, gambling everything on words written by a woman who'd loved from a distance and left breadcrumbs for a daughter-in-law she'd never met. The sun slanted lower by the time they reached Harrison's office again. The lawyer looked unsurprised to see them return so quickly, as if he'd anticipated exactly this response. This timeline, this progression from shock to acceptance to determination. He pulled forms that had been prepared in advance authorization to access the designated account documents, establishing Sarah as executor of Elizabeth Coleman's estate, pending final resolution of Richard's legal challenge, papers that needed signatures in 3 places and initials in 5 more. The account is at Pinewood County Credit Union. You can withdraw up to $5,000 immediately for emergency purposes. The remainder requires my counter-signature for any transaction exceeding $1,000 per Mrs. Coleman's specific instructions. Sarah signed it where indicated her hand steady, despite the surreal feeling that this was happening to someone else, some other widow in some other life where dead mothers-in-law left property and money and cryptic warnings about brothers who'd do anything to claim what they believed they deserved. Harrison slid a business card across the desk, plain white with black lettering and a phone number that started with the same area code as the property. Helen Wright. She was Mrs. Coleman's closest friend, possibly her only friend. She knows the area, knows the history, and she's expecting your call. Mrs. Coleman made arrangements. Of course she had. Elizabeth Coleman had apparently spent years preparing for this eventuality, watching and planning and organizing an inheritance that came with instructions and warnings and a support network Sarah hadn't asked for but desperately needed. It felt intrusive and generous in equal measure, this dead woman's determination to orchestrate salvation from beyond the grave. The credit union was still open when they arrived, small-town banking hours extending past 5, because everyone knew everyone, and flexibility was less policy than courtesy. The teller processed the withdrawal without comment, counted out $5,000 in hundreds and fifties that Sarah tucked into the inside pocket of her jacket, where it pressed against her ribs like both promise and weight. More money than she'd held at one time in her entire life. Enough to buy tent and sleeping bags and propane stove and water containers, and still have thousands left for materials and labor when building became possible rather than theoretical. They spent the remaining daylight at a camping supply store where the clerk's enthusiasm suggested he didn't often see customers planning extended outdoor living situations. Sarah bought practical items, basic items, things James would have chosen if James were here to make these decisions. Canvas tent rated for 4-season use, sleeping bags that claimed warmth to 20 below, cookware that nested to save space, LED lanterns that ran on batteries and would provide light when darkness came too early and stayed too late. Marcus helped carry everything to the truck. Garrett had agreed to drive them in for another day, his young muscles straining with weight that would have been nothing to his father, but felt significant to a 12-year-old trying to fill shoes that didn't fit yet. By the time they returned to the property, their property, Sarah forced herself to think their land. Now, regardless of Richard Coleman's objections, evening had settled into the spaces between trees. Garrett helped them unload, showed Marcus how to stake the tent properly so wind wouldn't collapse. It demonstrated the propane stove's ignition sequence and safety features. His movements carried the easy competence of experience, someone who'd done this before, or at least understood that survival in wild spaces required respecting details city dwellers took for granted. "I'll be back tomorrow with water," he said as he prepared to leave. "Spring's a quarter mile that way." He pointed into darkness that revealed nothing. "But you'll want containers and a path cleared before trying to haul your own. And Mrs. Mitchell." He paused, truck door open, 1 foot already inside. "Lock this tent tonight." Mrs. Coleman wasn't wrong about Richard. Man's got money and connections and a mean streak that runs deep when things don't go his way. He left before Sarah could ask what that meant specifically, what form Richard's meanness might take, whether the warning was precautionary or imminent. The truck's taillights disappeared through the trees, and then they were alone. Sarah and 3 children and 15 acres of darkness punctuated by sounds she couldn't identify and fears she couldn't voice without making them more real. They ate cold sandwiches purchased at a gas station, drank bottled water that tasted like plastic and chemicals, and arranged sleeping bags inside the tent that smelled new and synthetic and temporary. Lily fell asleep first, exhausted by the day's emotional weight. Evan followed within minutes, his small body curled against Sarah's side, seeking warmth and reassurance. Marcus lay awake longer, his breathing too controlled to be natural, his stillness too deliberate to be relaxed. "Mom," his whisper barely disturbed the darkness. "Are we safe here?" Sarah wanted to say yes, wanted to promise that safety was guaranteed, that she'd protect them, that the tent's canvas walls would keep out whatever threats the night held. But she'd promised not to lie, and lies of comfort were still lies regardless of good intentions. I don't know, but we're together and that's going to have to be enough. Marcus accepted this the way he'd accepted his father's death and their eviction and all the other harsh truths life had delivered before he'd developed the armor to deflect them. He rolled over, gave up on sleep or pretended to, and Sarah lay listening to night sounds that meant nothing to someone raised on city noise, where sirens and traffic and humanity's constant motion provided familiar soundtrack to darkness. Sometime after midnight, she'd lost track of time without her phone's glow to mark hours footsteps approached through grass. Sarah's eyes snapped open, every muscle tensing. The footsteps circled the tent slowly, deliberately, someone testing boundaries or making their presence known or simply observing what the new residents looked like from outside their fragile shelter. She held her breath, hand reaching for Marcus in the darkness, finding his shoulder and squeezing once to communicate silence. The footsteps stopped, paused, then retreated, fading back into the night they'd emerged from. Sarah waited, counting heartbeats, straining to hear if the visitor had truly gone or merely withdrawn to observe from greater distance. No more sounds came. No voices called out. No threats materialized into action. But in the morning when she emerged from the tent blinking in early light, she found it a sign, wooden and freshly painted, planted it in the ground 10 feet from where they'd slept. Disputed property. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Someone had been here. Someone wanted them to know they'd been watched, that their presence had been noted, that whatever claims Elizabeth's will made, someone else had claims too, and wasn't afraid to enforce them through intimidation if necessary. Sarah pulled the sign from the ground. The wood was new, the paint barely dry. Whoever had placed it had done so recently. Maybe while they slept, maybe while they'd lain awake listening to footsteps that came and went like warnings whispered in darkness. She looked at the collapsed house, the tent, the trees surrounding them in every direction, the sky visible through gaps in the canopy where light reached down like judgment or benediction, depending on how you chose to interpret God's attention. 45 days until the court hearing, 12 months to prove they belonged here. 6 more envelopes hidden somewhere on land she didn't know, containing truths about families and choices and love that looked like abandonment if you didn't understand the full story. Sarah Mitchell gripped the sign tight enough to feel splinters pressing into her palm, and she made herself a promise, the kind of promise that felt less like hope and more like defiance, less like optimism, and more like refusal to be broken by one more thing when everything else had already tried and failed. They weren't leaving, not for Richard Coleman, not for his money and lawyers and midnight intimidation tactics. Not for anyone. This land was theirs now, and if someone wanted to take it, they'd have to do more than plant signs in the night and hope fear did their work for them. Garrett returned before noon with water containers stacked in the truck bed and news that spread unease through Sarah's chest like ink in clean water. Richard Coleman had been asking questions around town who'd seen the new people at the old Coleman place, what they looked like, how long they planned to stay. The questions carried edges sharp enough to draw blood if you leaned into them wrong. Man's not subtle when he wants something. Garrett hauled a 5-gallon jug from the truck muscles, corded with the kind of strength that came from decades rather than gyms. Offered Billy Henderson $50 to report back what y'all do each day. Billy told him to take his money and choke on it, but plenty others in town wouldn't have that particular moral backbone. Sarah helped stack containers near the tent, her mind calculating distances and logistics, and how many trips per day they'd need to keep 4 people hydrated in summer heat that turned canvas walls into ovens by mid-afternoon. The spring Garrett had mentioned lay beyond a tangle of undergrowth and fallen timber that would take hours to clear properly. What exactly does Richard want with this land? Garrett's pause stretched long enough to carry weight beyond simple consideration. When he spoke, his words came careful and measured, like someone navigating a conversation mined with potential explosions. There's talk. Old talk, mostly the kind that gets repeated until nobody remembers if it started as fact or speculation. Story goes, Elizabeth's daddy worked these acres back in the 40s, found color in the creek. Color. Gold. Not much, not enough for commercial operation, but enough to make a man wonder what else might be hiding in the ground if you knew where to look. The letter's warning crystallized into sharper, focused value buried here, Richard willing to do anything hurry before others find what Elizabeth had hidden. Not sentiment, not family history, actual geological wealth that could be measured in dollars instead of memories. And Richard believes in money and what it can buy, which in his experience has been near about everything except the things he wants most. Garrett lifted another jug, carried it toward the growing stack with movements efficient from repetition. Man's got 3 ex-wives, 2 kids who won't speak to him, and a business empire built on buying low and selling high with no particular care for who gets crushed in between. Elizabeth left him out of the will deliberate like, and that sits in his craw, same way everything that doesn't go his way sits there and festers. Marcus appeared from the tent, hair disheveled from sleep that had come late and restless. He'd woken twice during the night at sounds Sarah had assured him were animals, despite not actually knowing what sounds animals made in wilderness and when humans invaded their territory. The boy's face held exhaustion, layered over worry, layered over determination, emotional strata that shouldn't exist in 12-year-old geology, but did carved there by circumstances that had stripped childhood down to its essential bones. Can I help? Garrett assessed him with eyes that had probably raised sons of their own, knew the value of work in teaching boys how to become men who could carry their share and then some. You know how to swing an axe? No, sir. Then today you learn. They spent the next 3 hours clearing brush toward the spring, Marcus wielding a hatchet under Garrett's patient instruction, while Sarah and Lily gathered the debris into piles that would eventually become firewood once they had time to let it dry properly. Evan discovered a collection of smooth stones near what had been the collapsed house's foundation and arranged them into patterns that made sense in 6-year-old logic, largest to smallest, then by color, then by some classification system known only to him. The work felt good in ways Sarah hadn't expected. Physical labor with visible results. Progress measured in cleared feet and stacked wood and muscle fatigue that would translate to sleep earned rather than sleep stolen between anxiety spikes. For the first time since James died, she wasn't cleaning someone else's dirt or serving someone else's needs. This mess belonged to them. This progress served their own survival. The distinction mattered more than she'd realized it could. By late afternoon, they'd carved a rough path to the spring, 30 yards of uneven ground that required watching your step but no longer required machete work to traverse. The spring itself emerged from between rocks, worn smooth by water's patient insistence, pooling in a basin maybe 4 feet across before trickling downhill toward wherever water went when geography and gravity reached consensus. Garrett tested it with a kit from his truck, declared it safe enough for drinking, once boiled better than most, well water if you didn't mind minerals. They were hauling full jugs back to camp when the car arrived, expensive, an out-of-place sedan with city plates and paint that had never known dirt roads. It stopped where the track widened slightly, and the man who emerged wore a suit that cost more than Sarah's entire wardrobe, including shoes and the winter coat she'd pawned last March when electricity mattered more than warmth. Richard Coleman looked exactly like someone who'd inherited money and multiplied it through calculated cruelty. 60, maybe tall and broad in ways that suggested high school athletics, followed by decades of maintenance routines designed to preserve the physique that had once defined him. His face carried the peculiar smoothness of work done not enough to be obvious, but enough to erase lines that should have mapped a life lived. Everything about him projected control and ownership, and the fundamental certainty that the world bent to accommodate his preferences or suffered consequences. Mrs. Mitchell. His voice matched his appearance, cultured and cold, practiced at civility that concealed contempt. I wanted to introduce myself properly rather than through lawyers and paperwork. Sarah set down the water jug, positioned herself between Richard and the children in movements that felt instinctive as breathing. Garrett stood slightly to her left, silent but present, radiating the kind of stillness that communicated readiness without requiring explicit threat. Mr. Coleman, your sign was very welcoming. Ah, yes, that. He smiled without warmth, lips moving while eyes stayed flat as painted stones. I assumed you'd been misinformed about the property status. My sister's mental state was questionable. Toward the end medication, you understand confusion about her actual wishes versus what predatory strangers convinced her to write. The accusation landed with enough force that Sarah felt Marcus stiffen beside her, felt Lily's small hand find her own and squeeze tight enough to communicate fear or anger, or both compressed into the grip of an 8-year-old who'd learned too young that adults lie and power protects liars better than truth protects the powerless. Elizabeth seemed quite clear in her intentions. Elizabeth spent her last decade watching your family from distance because engaging directly would have violated the restraining order her ex-husband obtained when she wouldn't accept that James wanted nothing to do with her. Richard's delivery suggested facts established and incontestable history written by victors who controlled the narrative. The courts recognized her instability then. They'll recognize the pattern now, when I demonstrate how a desperate woman with no connection to my sister manufactured relationships, and manipulated a confused elderly woman into signing away property that rightfully belongs to blood family. Sarah's jaw tightened against responses that would only feed whatever confrontation Richard had orchestrated by driving 90 miles to deliver threats in person. She'd learned in 2 years of widowmaking that engaging with people who'd decided you were enemy meant giving them ammunition to use against you later, when recordings might exist, or witnesses might testify, or your own anger might be reframed as instability that justified whatever actions others claimed necessary for protection. If you have legal concerns, take them to court. Otherwise, you're trespassing on property I currently possess legal claim to regardless of your objections. Something flickered across Richard's face, surprise maybe, or recalculation, the momentary discomfort of someone accustomed to intimidation working, who'd encountered resistance instead of capitulation. He recovered quickly, smoothed the expression back to neutral civility with practice that suggested frequent use. I see my sister chose well. Stubborn determination can look very much like stupidity when you don't understand what you're fighting for. He turned back toward his car, paused with door open. Enjoy your camping trip, Mrs. Mitchell. I suspect novelty will wear thin once you realize how many things can go wrong in isolated places where help arrives slowly, if it arrives at all. The sedan navigated the rutted track with difficulty, bottoming out twice before disappearing into trees that swallowed it like everything else that didn't belong here. Sarah's hands trembled slightly, adrenaline or rage or fear, possibly all three combined into the physiological response her body defaulted to when threatened by forces larger than herself. He's going to hurt us, isn't he? Lily's question emerged small and certain, the observation of someone who'd watched her father die and her mother struggle and knew firsthand that the universe didn't prevent bad things from happening to people who'd already suffered enough. Sarah, crouched to eye level, framed her daughter's face between palms that had scrubbed floors and changed diapers, and never once struck in anger, despite provocations that would have justified lesser violence. He's going to try to scare us into leaving, but being scared and leaving are different choices, and we get to choose which one matters more. Night settled with the abruptness of summer transitioning to autumn temperature, dropping from pleasant to cold in the hour between sundown and full dark. They ate beans heated over the propane stove, bread going stale but still edible apples Garrett had brought that tasted like ordinary miracles when food security remained theoretical rather than guaranteed. Lily drew pictures by lantern light horses, mostly sometimes houses with smoke curling from chimneys, and flowers growing in yards where grass stayed green instead of dying from neglect. Evan fell asleep mid-sentence, exhaustion claiming him between one breath and the next. Marcus helped clean the makeshift dishes, his young face thoughtful in ways that worried Sarah more than his fear would have. Thinking meant planning. Planning meant taking action, and 12-year-old boys' actions tended toward confrontational solutions that satisfied emotional needs while ignoring practical consequences. Don't do anything stupid. She made it statement rather than question certainty instead of request. Like what? Like thinking you need to protect us from Richard Coleman by doing something that gives him ammunition to use against us in court. Marcus's jaw worked as he processed this, turning possibilities over in his mind with the careful deliberation he'd inherited from James, along with brown eyes and the stubborn cowlick that refused to lay flat no matter how much water you applied. So we just let him threaten us. We document threats, report them to Mr. Harrison, and let lawyers handle legal battles while we handle survival. Sarah dried the last plate, stacked it with others in the plastic bin that served as their kitchen. Fighting only works when you're evenly matched. We're not, so we get smart instead of getting even. Understanding crossed Marcus's expression, reluctant acceptance of strategies that felt like cowardice to someone whose father had taught him men protect their families, men stand against threats, men don't back down when challenged. But James was dead, and the lessons he'd passed on needed updating for realities where strength meant knowing when fighting would lose you everything you were trying to protect. They sealed themselves in the tent as darkness completed its conquest of everything beyond the lantern's small circle. Sarah lay listening to breathing that gradually synchronized into the rhythm of sleep, her own mind too active for rest, turning over Richard's words and Garrett's warnings, and the letter's insistence that hurry mattered because someone else was searching. The footsteps came after midnight, again multiple sets this time, at least 2 people moving through brush, with the practiced quiet of those who'd learned stealth through repetition. They approached from different directions, flanking the tent in coordination that suggested planning rather than coincidence. Sarah's hand found the flashlight thumb resting on the switch without pressing. waiting to see if illumination would help or harm their situation. A sound she couldn't identify, scraping metal maybe, or tools being positioned. Then voices low and male and discussing something in tones too quiet to parse words from syllables. The tent wall rustled as someone brushed against it, and Sarah nearly screamed before clamping control over her vocal cords through sheer will. "I know you're awake in there," Richard's voice, unmistakable, even pitched to carry without shouting. "I know you're scared. Good. You should be. This land has history, accidents, disappearances, fires that started from nothing and consumed everything. Beautiful place to visit. Terrible place to die alone where nobody hears you screaming." The footsteps retreated. Truck engines starting some distance away, headlights sweeping through trees briefly, before vanishing towards civilization and laws that only mattered when witnesses existed to enforce them. Sarah's heart hammered against ribs that suddenly felt too fragile to contain anything as vital as the organ keeping her alive. Beside her, Marcus had gone rigid, his breathing shallow and controlled in ways that communicated awareness despite closed eyes. "He's trying to break us." Marcus's whisper barely disturbed the air between them. "Make us too scared to stay." "I know. Is it working?" Sarah considered honest answers versus comforting lies landed somewhere in the middle where truth lived but didn't have to be absolute. "I'm terrified. But I've been terrified before when your dad died, when we got evicted, when I didn't know how I'd feed you. Terror doesn't mean quit. It just means the stakes are high enough to matter." Morning revealed what the night visitors had left tire tracks circling the tent multiple times. Boot prints pressed deep where they'd stood watching, and the propane tank for the stove moved 10 feet from where they'd positioned it. The violation felt worse than theft. Someone had been here, touched their things, demonstrated the ability to harm while choosing instead to terrify. The message was clear. We can reach you anytime. Distance means nothing. Isolation is your weakness, not your protection. Garrett arrived with the sunrise, took one look at the disturbed ground, and his expression went hard and as granite cooled from molten rage. "That stupid son of a—" He caught himself, glanced at the children, redirected. "This is escalation. He's testing boundaries, seeing if fear moves you when legal pressure doesn't. What do we do? Document everything. Photograph the tracks, the moved tank, anything disturbed. Then we call the sheriff and make formal complaint, even though Buck Peterson is Richard's fishing buddy and won't do a damn thing except write a report nobody reads." They spent an hour photographing evidence with Sarah's cheap phone, the images grainy but clear enough to show pattern and intent. Garrett walked the perimeter, pointing out where vehicles had been positioned, how many people had walked through based on boot print variations, the timeline suggested by disturbed dew and grass that had been flattened hours ago, rather than minutes. The sheriff arrived near noon, late 50s, substantial belly testing, his uniform's buttons eyes, that had seen enough of humanity's worst to develop the weary cynicism cops acquired when idealism died from prolonged exposure to reality's uglier aspects. Buck Peterson took their statement with the enthusiasm of someone fulfilling obligation rather than pursuing justice, wrote details in a notebook with handwriting that suggested medical school dropout, and offered platitudes about increased patrols that everyone present knew were lies wrapped in uniforms and presented as civic duty. "Look, Mrs. Mitchell, I'll be straight with you." Buck closed his notebook, tucked it away with finality that communicated conversation ending, regardless of whether all points had been addressed. "Richard Coleman is, well, he's Richard Coleman. Man owns half the commercial property in the county, sits on boards that determine budgets, knows people who know people. That doesn't make him right, but it does make accusations complicated when evidence is circumstantial and witnesses are scarce." Sarah felt fury rise hot and acidic, tasted it on her tongue like copper in betrayal. "So he can threaten us with impunity because he has money and connections. I'm saying pick your battles carefully. You're new here. He's got roots deeper than those oaks, and roots win when the ground starts shifting." Buck moved toward his cruiser, paused with door open. "But if something happens, something actionable, something I can take to the district attorney without getting laughed out of his office, you call me directly. That's the best I can offer given circumstances you're probably starting to understand ain't fair and weren't designed to be." When he'd gone, Garrett spat into the dirt with disgust that required no verbal elaboration. They'd confirmed what Sarah had already known. The system-protected power laws favored those who could afford lawyers who knew which judges to approach and which loopholes to exploit, and justice was a theoretical concept that existed more in imagination than implementation. "We need to accelerate construction." Garrett studied the collapsed house, the clear ground around it, the foundation that was apparently still sound beneath decades of neglect. Get you into actual shelter before Richard decides escalation means action instead of threats. With what money the inheritance account requires Mr. Harrison's signature for large withdrawals. Then we use what we have, build small and practical, expand later when legal situations clarify. Garrett pulled out his phone, scrolled through contacts accumulated over a lifetime of knowing people who knew how to do things. I got a friend, Clayton Dalton, everyone calls him Clay. Man can build anything from scrap and determination. If anyone can turn 50,000 into livable structure fast enough to matter, it's him. Clay arrived the following afternoon driving a truck older than Marcus' bed loaded with tools that showed the wear patterns of frequent use and careful maintenance. He was maybe 55, lean in the way of men who'd been working physical jobs since before the work had a chance to make them soft, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from wood and eyes that assessed the situation with the practiced evaluation of someone who'd seen enough projects to know which ones would work and which ones were disasters waiting for opportunity. Garrett says you need a miracle on a budget. Clay's voice carried the rough gravel of someone who'd smoked for decades and quit too late to fully reverse the damage. I specialize in making do with less than ideal circumstances. They walked the property together, Clay examining the foundation with intensity that suggested reading invisible text written in cracked concrete and settled earth. He knocked on remnants of wall studs, measured distances with a tape that stretched and retracted on spring tension, made notations in a small notebook with a pencil he kept behind his ear, like surgeons kept scalpels close during operations. Foundation's solid. Someone built this to last, and last it has, even if everything above ground gave up the fight. Clay straightened, brushed dust from his jeans and movements automatic from repetition. I can give you 2 bedrooms combined, living, kitchen area, 1 bathroom. Won't be pretty, but it'll be weatherproof and pass basic safety inspection if the inspector isn't actively looking to fail you. 45,000 for materials and my labor. 3 months if weather cooperates. Sarah did the math quickly. 45,000 left, 5,000 for emergencies and unexpected costs that always materialized because Murphy's Law was the one law that actually functioned regardless of money or connections. 3 months meant they'd be living in the tent through October, November if delays happened. But it also meant they'd have real shelter before winter turned camping into potential death sentence. When can you start? Tomorrow. But I need to be honest about complications. Clay's expression suggested he was someone who'd learned that honesty up front saved problems later, even when honesty cost him work. Richard Coleman tried to hire me last week, offered triple my usual rate to refuse any job from you, make sure you stayed living in that tent until cold or fear or common sense drove you away. I told him where he could shove his money and his job offer, both, which means I've made an enemy of someone who doesn't forget slights. You hire me, you're getting quality work, but also inheriting whatever retaliation Richard directs at people who side against him. Seems we're collecting enemies faster than we're collecting anything else. Sarah extended her hand, watched Clay grip it with strength that communicated both capability and commitment. Welcome to the cause of people too stubborn to know when they're beaten. Clay grinned, sudden and genuine, transforming his weathered face into something younger and more hopeful than circumstance probably warranted. Stubbornness is underrated virtue in my experience. Builds better houses than optimism ever did. The key from the metal box opened account number 237 at Pinewood County Credit Union revealed the $50,000 exactly as Mr. Harrison had promised. Sarah withdrew $45,000 in certified check made out to Clayton Dalton with memo line reading construction services in her careful handwriting. The weight of that transaction, spending more money than she'd ever possessed on a structure that existed only in plans and promises, made her hands shake slightly as she signed authorization forms. Work began the next morning with demolition that felt therapeutic, despite accomplishing nothing except clearing space for whatever came next. Clay brought 2 helpers, his nephew Derek, who was studying architecture but needed summer work, and a woman named Rosa, whose carpentry skills Clay vouched for with the kind of respect that transcended gender assumptions about who could swing hammers and read levels. They worked with efficient coordination, reducing what remained of the collapsed structure to sorted piles of salvageable versus garbage, clearing the foundation completely within 3 days. Marcus attached himself to the construction crew with determination that would have been annoying if Clay hadn't recognized it as hunger for knowledge and purpose rather than simple observation. The boy learned to measure twice and cut once, learned that level meant exactly level, and close enough meant doing it over until close enough became precise, learned that construction was applied math and physics wrapped in sawdust and sweat. Lily discovered the overgrown garden behind where the house had been raised beds someone had built decades ago. Wood rotted, but soil still rich with whatever amendments the original gardener had mixed in before time and neglect reclaimed the space. She began clearing it with hand tools borrowed from Clay, pulling weeds with the focused intensity of someone given mission and permission to pursue it. Within a week, she had tomatoes transplanted from starts. Rosa brought beans planted in rows, measured with string and stakes herbs, growing in the sunniest corner, where Clay said Elizabeth used to sit on summer mornings drinking coffee and watching birds claim feeders that had long since fallen to entropy. Evan collected things interesting rocks, pieces of glass smoothed by weather into gems that caught light feathers, from birds whose species he documented in a notebook Garrett gave him, along with a field guide to regional wildlife. The boy created inventory systems and categories that made sense as six-year-old logic arranged his collections with the seriousness of curators organizing museum exhibitions. When asked why, he simply stated, "Someone should remember what was here before we changed it." The wisdom of that observation settled in Sarah's chest with the weight of truths children saw clearly because they hadn't learned yet to look past surfaces toward complications adults invented to justify their own failures. This land had existed before them, would exist after. Their presence was temporary regardless of legal claims or 12-month requirements. What they built or destroyed mattered less than how they stewarded what they'd been given custody of for the brief moment when Elizabeth's generosity intersected with their desperation. 4 weeks into construction, Victoria Coleman arrived unannounced in a sensible sedan that had known dirt roads before and didn't panic at rough conditions. She was perhaps 45, dressed in casual clothes that managed to project competence without formality, with Elizabeth's cheekbones and eyes, but warmer, somehow less guarded, as if life had treated her more kindly than it had her older sister. "I'm Victoria, Elizabeth's niece, which makes me James's cousin, which makes your children my family, even if we've never met and circumstances were designed to prevent exactly that." She spoke quickly, words tumbling over each other like someone who'd been holding them inside too long and feared silence would steal her courage before everything important got said. "I wanted to come sooner, but Richard has people watching me too, and I needed to be careful about when and how because he's got lawyers who'd love to prove I'm conspiring against family interests or whatever legal fiction they'd construct to isolate you further." Sarah studied her carefully, looking for deception or agenda, or the kind of manipulation that came wrapped in sympathy and delivered with smiles. But Victoria's hands shook slightly as she spoke, and her eyes kept darting toward the children with something that looked like longing, or regret, or maybe just the grief of connections lost before they could be formed. "Why are you here?" "To tell you the truth about your husband's family, about why Elizabeth had to leave James, about what Richard really wants and what he's capable of doing to get it." Victoria pulled a folder from her bag, thick with documents and photographs, that spilled across the makeshift table Clay had constructed from sawhorses and plywood. "And to beg you to be careful because my uncle doesn't make idle threats, and his definition of necessary force has gotten people hurt before when obstacles wouldn't move themselves." 5 weeks after construction began, Evan was playing near the creek, supervised from distance by Lily, who'd been explicitly told not to let her younger brother drown or disappear or encounter wildlife larger than squirrels. He came running back with something clutched in his fist, face bright with the particular excitement of children who'd found treasure regardless of whether adults would recognize it as valuable. "Mom, look what the water had." The stone in his palm caught afternoon light and threw it back in colors that didn't occur naturally in ordinary rocks. Sarah's pulse quickened despite knowing better, despite Victoria's assurance that geological surveys had found nothing commercial, despite understanding that hope was dangerous when it attached to outcomes beyond her control. Clay examined the stone with professional interest, turned it in his fingers, held it to the light from multiple angles. His expression shifted from curiosity to surprise to something carefully neutral that suggested significant effort to control reaction. "That's placer gold. Small piece, maybe a gram if you're lucky, but real." He looked toward the creek, then back at Sarah with eyes that communicated complexity words would take too long to unpack. "Elizabeth told me once that her father found enough to matter, not enough to advertise. She panned a little herself over the years, kept it quiet, because once word got out, people would come looking. People like Richard, who'd use discovery as justification for claims that had nothing to do with actual geology and everything to do with greed dressed as family legacy." Sarah's mind raced through implications, calculating possibilities against risks. If there was gold, real gold, in quantities that mattered, Richard's obsession made more sense. His willingness to threaten and harass and escalate suddenly looked less like irrational vendetta and more like calculated campaign against obstacle between him and wealth he believed rightfully his. We don't tell anyone. Sarah made it statement rather than question decision instead of suggestion. Not the lawyers, not the court, nobody. If Richard finds out there's actual gold here, he'll claim we hid material facts manipulated. Elizabeth committed fraud to acquire property we knew contained valuable resources. Clay nodded slowly, recognition passing between them, of shared understanding that truth sometimes required silence when speaking would provide ammunition to enemies. Victoria's right about one thing: what matters isn't what's buried in the ground. It's what you build on top of it. Houses last longer than gold rush fever, and family beats fortune when you're measuring what actually matters. The words settled into Sarah's chest with the weight of philosophy she wanted to believe, but couldn't quite embrace. When rent had been constant worry, and hunger had been daily companion, and gold represented security, money could purchase, even if meaning required something deeper. She looked at Evan's bright face, at the stone he'd found through luck or providence or simple childish persistence that paid attention where adults had learned to look past. Maybe both were true. Gold mattered and didn't matter, had value and was worthless, depended entirely on what you were willing to trade for the security it promised. 10 days later, Helen Wright appeared, 70-something, white hair, cut practical and short-moving, with the careful precision of someone whose joints complained, but whose mind refused to surrender to age's incremental theft of capability. She brought a key, small and gold-plated, along with the kind of smile that suggested she'd been waiting years to deliver whatever message Elizabeth had entrusted to her. "You're tougher than I expected. Elizabeth said you would be, but I've learned not to trust the living's assessment of the dead's judgment until proof presents itself." Helen's voice carried the rough edges of someone who'd smoked for decades and quit recently enough that the damage hadn't fully healed. "She wanted you to have this after you'd proven you could survive the first month. Figured if you lasted that long, you deserved what comes next." The key opened nothing Sarah could see immediately, but Helen's directions led them 4 miles down a service road to what had once been a railway station, serving timber operations that shut down in the 60s when automation and economics shifted jobs elsewhere. The building stood empty, but structurally sound: wood siding, weathered gray, but intact windows boarded rather than broken. Inside smelled of dust and time and abandonment, not rot exactly, but the particular staleness of air that hadn't circulated in decades. Helen navigated through the main room to a back office, knelt with visible effort, and revealed a floor panel that came up when you knew where to press. The compartment below held a wooden chest sealed with a lock that yielded to the golden key. Inside, documents establishing ownership of the train station itself, plus the half-acre it sat on, $25,000 in cash wrapped in plastic to protect against moisture, and 2 envelopes marked with numbers 4 and 5 in Elizabeth's careful handwriting. Sarah opened number 4, hands trembling slightly with anticipation or fear, or the volatile mixture of both that came from knowing revelations mattered, but not yet knowing if they'd help or harm. The letter inside explained the train station had been purchased specifically with the children in mind, property in town near the better school district, place they could live during the week when education required proximity to resources the remote land couldn't provide. Elizabeth had thought of everything planned for contingencies Sarah hadn't known to consider, built infrastructure for futures that extended beyond immediate survival into long-term thriving. Envelope 5 contained something different: records of the children's births, vaccination histories, school transcripts Sarah had lost during various evictions and moves, all carefully preserved and organized, but also photographs and notes documenting each child's interests and talents as observed from distance over years. Marcus's aptitude for mathematics and building, Lily's artistic eye and the way she'd arranged toys by color and shape, Evan's fascination with patterns and classification systems. She saw them. Sarah's throat tightened around words that wanted to become sobs, but got compressed into something smaller and more controlled. Really saw them, understood who they were becoming, cared enough to document their growth, even though she couldn't be present for it. Helen nodded, her old eyes bright with tears she didn't bother hiding. Elizabeth loved fiercely and from distance because George and Richard made presence too dangerous. But distance doesn't diminish love if the love is real enough to survive separation. She knew every important moment in those children's lives, celebrated privately, grieved when they struggled, planned for their futures with the kind of detail that only comes from caring past the point where caring is convenient or easy. The court date arrived with the inevitability of all deadlines. 45 days had somehow compressed into 6 weeks into now, and ready or not, Sarah would stand before Judge Theodore Brennan and argue for the right to keep what Elizabeth had given and Richard was determined to take. The photographs Victoria spread across the plywood showed a story Sarah thought she'd known but had never actually understood. Elizabeth had 20 bruises on her arms she'd tried to hide with long sleeves. James at 4, small and solemn in ways children shouldn't be. George Mitchell, looming in background, frames his presence distorting every image even when he stood at the edges. Elizabeth married my Uncle George when she was 17. He was 32, established, respected in the community as someone who'd built a successful construction business from nothing. Victoria's fingers traced the edge of one photograph, her touch gentle as if the paper itself might bruise. What nobody saw, what he made sure nobody could see, was that he beat her, systematically, methodically, with the kind of control that never left marks visible in public spaces. Marcus had gone very still, his young face processing implications that connected directly to the father he remembered, the grandfather he'd never met, the family history that suddenly carried darker weight than simple abandonment. When James turned 5, Elizabeth tried to leave, filed for divorce, got a lawyer, started building the case for sole custody. Victoria pulled out legal documents yellowed with age restraining orders and custody filings and motions that painted procedural picture of a woman fighting through proper channels. George retaliated by threatening to kill James, not Elizabeth, James. Told her if she pursued custody, if she showed up at school or tried to contact their son in any way, he'd make it look like an accident and there wouldn't be enough evidence to prove anything, except that children died sometimes, and mothers who abandoned them had to live with that knowledge forever. Sarah's stomach twisted. The scenario was specific enough to be credible, horrifying enough to explain why someone might choose decades of distance over risking their child's life. She believed him. Sarah heard her own voice emerge smaller than intended, compressed by the weight of imagining choices no one should face. She watched him kill their dog when it barked too much, drowned it in the bathtub while she listened from the locked bedroom. He did it slow, made sure she heard every sound, then told her that was gentle compared to what accidents could look like if she kept pushing for things George had decided she couldn't have. Lily had pressed herself against Sarah's side, small body rigid with horror, at adults who hurt children, who made threats that required believing because disbelief might cost everything. Even Evan had stopped organizing his rock collection, his 6-year-old instincts recognizing conversations that carried freight too heavy for his understanding, but real enough for him to demand attention. So she left. Signed in preface to giving George full custody, agreed to supervise visitation she knew he'd never allow, and moved 300 miles away to start over where he couldn't find her easily. Victoria's voice cracked slightly, emotion bleeding through the recitation of facts she'd probably told herself many times trying to make peace with family history. But she hired investigators, kept track, followed James's life through school records and photographs taken from safe distances. Made money as an accountant, invested carefully, bought this land when the original owner died and sold it cheap because nobody wanted property this remote. And Richard, Sarah already knew the answer, could see the shape of it forming from evidence accumulated over weeks of threats and midnight visits and warnings delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for actions taken in darkness. Richard is George's younger brother, was before George died 8 years ago. They were cut from the same cloth, believed women existed to serve children, existed to obey, and money could purchase whatever force alone couldn't accomplish. Victoria gathered the photographs, stacked them with care that suggested they were precious despite the pain they documented. When Elizabeth wrote her will, leaving everything to you and the children, Richard saw it as betrayal of family blood. In his worldview, you're an outsider who manipulated a vulnerable woman. He genuinely believes he's the hero recovering stolen property from a con artist. The framework shifted context, realigning facts into patterns that made terrible sense. Richard wasn't simply greedy. He was righteous in his greed, convinced his claim carried moral weight that justified whatever methods he employed. Men like that were more dangerous than simple criminals because they could hurt you while believing themselves virtuous, could escalate without guilt to constrain their actions. What does he think is buried here? Victoria hesitated, and in that pause, Sarah read confirmation of suspicions that had been forming since Garrett first mentioned gold, since the letter warned about value that required hurrying. There's a creek at the back of the property. Elizabeth's father panned it in the 40s, found enough color to fund his daughter's education. Not much, a few $1,000s over several years. But Richard believes has convinced himself, despite geological surveys saying otherwise, that there's a viable deposit waiting for proper excavation. He spent the last decade trying to buy this land from Elizabeth, offered prices far above market value for acreage this remote. When she refused repeatedly, he started making threats. When she died 3 months ago, he saw opportunity to seize through legal challenge what he couldn't acquire through negotiation. And the gold, Sarah needed to know if Richard's obsession had foundation or if he was chasing delusions expensive enough to justify the resources he'd already invested in harassment. Elizabeth had the entire property surveyed by 3 independent geological firms. All confirmed the same conclusion: minor traces, nothing commercially viable, certainly nothing worth the cost of extraction equipment and processing. Victoria met Sarah's eyes with steady certainty. What's buried here isn't gold. It's the future Elizabeth wanted for James's children. Land they could build on, space they could grow into, foundation for lives not controlled by men like George and Richard, who believe ownership means the right to destroy whatever resists their will. 5 weeks after construction began, Evan was playing near the creek, supervised from distance by Lily, who'd been explicitly told not to let her younger brother drown, or disappear, or encounter wildlife larger than squirrels. He came running back with something clutched in his fist, face bright with the particular excitement of children who'd found treasure, regardless of whether adults would recognize it as valuable. "Mom, look what the water had." The stone in his palm caught afternoon light and threw it back in colors that didn't occur naturally in ordinary rocks. Sarah's pulse quickened despite knowing better. Despite Victoria's assurance that geological surveys had found nothing commercial, despite understanding that hope was dangerous when it attached to outcomes beyond her control. Clay examined the stone with professional interest, turned it in his fingers, held it to the light from multiple angles. His expression shifted from curiosity to surprise to something carefully neutral that suggested significant effort to control reaction. "That's placer gold. Small piece, maybe a gram if you're lucky, but real." He looked toward the creek, then back at Sarah with eyes that communicated complexity words would take too long to unpack. "Elizabeth told me once that her father found enough to matter, not enough to advertise. She panned a little herself over the years, kept it quiet because once word got out, then people would come looking. People like Richard, who'd used discovery as justification for claims that had nothing to do with actual geology and everything to do with greed dressed as family legacy." Sarah's mind raced through implications, calculating possibilities against risks. If there was gold, real gold, in quantities that mattered, Richard's obsession made more sense. His willingness to threaten and harass and escalate suddenly looked less like irrational vendetta and more like calculated campaign against obstacle between him and wealth he believed rightfully his. "We don't tell anyone." Sarah made its statement rather than question decision instead of suggestion. "Not the lawyers, not the court, nobody. If Richard finds out there's actual gold here, he'll claim, 'We hid material, facts manipulated. Elizabeth committed fraud to acquire property we knew contained valuable resources.'" Clay nodded slowly at recognition, passing between them of shared understanding that truth sometimes required silence when speaking would provide ammunition to enemies. "Victoria's right about one thing: what matters isn't what's buried in the ground. It's what you build on top of it. Houses last longer than gold rush fever, and family beats fortune when you're measuring what actually matters." 10 days later, Helen Wright appeared, 70-something, white hair, cut practical and short-moving, with the careful precision of someone whose joints complained, but whose mind refused to surrender to age's incremental theft of capability. She brought a key, small and gold-plated, along with the kind of smile that suggested she'd been waiting years to deliver whatever message Elizabeth had entrusted to her. "You're tougher than I expected. Elizabeth said you would be, but I've learned not to trust the living's assessment of the dead's judgment until proof presents itself." Helen's voice carried the rough edges of someone who'd smoked for decades and quit recently enough that the damage hadn't fully healed. "She wanted you to have this after you'd proven you could survive the first month. Figured if you lasted that long, you deserved what comes next." The key opened nothing Sarah could see immediately, but Helen's directions led them 4 miles down a service road to what had once been a railway station serving timber operations that shut down in the 60s when automation and economics shifted jobs elsewhere. The building stood empty, but structurally sound wood siding, weathered gray but intact windows, boarded rather than broken. Inside smelled of dust and time and abandonment, not rot exactly, but the particular staleness of air that hadn't circulated in decades. Helen navigated through the main room to a back office, knelt with visible effort, and revealed a floor panel that came up when you knew where to press. The compartment below held a wooden chest sealed with a lock that yielded to the golden key. Inside, documents establishing ownership of the train station itself, plus the half-acre it sat on, $25,000 in cash wrapped in plastic to protect against moisture, and 2 envelopes marked with numbers 4 and 5 in Elizabeth's careful handwriting. Envelope 4 explained the train station had been purchased for the children property in town, near better schools place they could live during the week when education required proximity to resources the remote land couldn't provide. Envelope 5 contained birth records, vaccination histories, school transcripts Sarah had lost during evictions, all carefully preserved, but also photographs and notes documenting each child's interests and talents observed from distance over years. She saw them. Sarah's throat tightened around words that wanted to become sobs, but got compressed into something smaller and more controlled. Really saw them, understood who they were becoming, cared enough to document their growth, even though she couldn't be present for it. Helen nodded, her old eyes bright with tears she didn't bother hiding. Elizabeth loved fiercely and from distance because George and Richard made presence too dangerous. But distance doesn't diminish love if the love is real enough to survive separation. The court date arrived with the inevitability of all deadlines. 45 days had somehow compressed into 6 weeks into now, and ready or not, Sarah would stand before Judge Theodore Brennan and argue for the right to keep what Elizabeth had given, and Richard was determined to take. The county courthouse occupied a brick building whose architecture suggested Depression-era public works, solid functional design to project authority without unnecessary ornamentation. Sarah dressed in the nicest clothes she owned, which still looked shabby compared to the attorneys who populated hallways in suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Mr. Harrison met her at the entrance, his expression carefully neutral, in ways that suggested he knew the odds and didn't want his pessimism to undermine her confidence. The courtroom held perhaps 60 people, Richard's supporters, townspeople, Victoria had convinced to attend, and media from the local paper interested in disputes involving money and land, and families that tore themselves apart over inheritance. Judge Brennan presided with the weathered authority of someone who'd heard every argument and believed very few whose patience for procedural games had been exhausted decades ago by lawyers who mistook verbosity for competence. Richard's attorney, Mr. Burke, 60 and sharp as surgical instruments, built his case with the methodical precision of someone who'd won more trials than he'd lost. Elizabeth Coleman had been mentally compromised by medication and age. The will had been executed under suspicious circumstances. Sarah Mitchell was an opportunist who'd manipulated a vulnerable woman for personal gain. Mr. Harrison countered with documentation, medical records showing Elizabeth's cognitive function remained intact until her death testimony from doctors who'd certified her competent witnesses who could speak to her clear intentions and sound reasoning. The children were blood descendants of Elizabeth's only child, giving them stronger family claim than a brother who'd been estranged for decades. But law wasn't logic. Law was interpretation and precedent in which arguments resonated with whoever held power to decide. Judge Brennan listened with expression that revealed nothing, asked pointed questions that suggested sharp mind evaluating evidence rather than accepting assertions, and recessed for lunch without indicating which direction his thoughts inclined. Marcus tugged Sarah's sleeve during the break, his face set with determination that looked too old for 12, too hardened by life, that had taught him adults couldn't always protect, and sometimes children had to speak for themselves. "Can I talk to the judge?" Sarah's instinct screamed, "No, keep the children out of it. Don't expose them to cross-examination or scrutiny, or the kind of attention that could twist innocent words into weapons against them." But she looked at her son's eyes and saw James looking back, saw the stubborn courage that had made his father climb scaffolding every day, despite fear of heights, because family needed income, and fear didn't pay bills. If the judge allows it. When court reconvened, Mr. Harrison requested permission for Marcus Mitchell to address the court directly. Burke objected on procedural grounds that felt more reflexive than substantive. Judge Brennan considered briefly, then nodded. Marcus walked to the witness stand with posture carefully straight, shoulders back, in ways Sarah had taught him for job interviews and important meetings, for moments when how you carried yourself mattered as much as what you said. The bailiff swore him in, and Marcus's hand on the Bible looked small and terribly young. The boy's voice emerged steady, and when he spoke, Sarah heard James in the cadence, heard herself in the word choice, heard something entirely, Marcus in the conviction that animated syllables into something more than mere testimony. "Your Honor, I don't know much about law. I'm 12, I know math and how to build things, and that my dad died 2 years ago in an accident that nobody called an accident until the insurance company needed reasons not to pay what they'd promised. He paused, gathering thoughts or courage or both. My grandmother, Elizabeth Coleman, who I never met, she watched us for years. Took pictures of birthdays and school plays, and ordinary days when nothing special happened except we were alive, and she cared enough to document it. Mr. Coleman, he gestured toward Richard without looking directly at him. Never came to my dad's funeral. Never sent a card when mom couldn't pay rent. Never cared until there was something to take. Burke started to object, but Judge Brennan's raised hand silenced him before words fully formed. Marcus continued, voice gaining strength from momentum and possibly from the rightness he believed in. With childhood's capacity for certainty about moral absolutes, adults learned to question. My grandmother left us land because she wanted us to have what she couldn't give my sense: safety space, a future that wasn't controlled by people who thought money meant they owned everything, including other people's choices. We've lived in a tent for 2 months. My mom works all day helping build our house, then stays up at night planning how to make everything work. My little brother found rocks and studied them until he could tell you every species of mineral in this county. My sister grew a garden from dirt nobody thought could support anything except weeds. He took a breath, and in that space Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the room's collective attention focused on the child who'd somehow become the most compelling argument for why inheritance mattered beyond legal technicalities. Mr. Coleman has 3 houses, has money and lawyers and power to make things happen however he wants. We have a tent and a half-built house and a dead woman's belief that we deserve chance she never got. I don't think law should favor people who already have everything over people who have nothing except the willingness to fight for the little bit someone tried to give them. Silence held for 3 seconds that stretched elastic and strange. Then Lily stood from where she'd been sitting behind Sarah, her 8-year-old voice cutting through the quiet with the particular clarity of children who hadn't learned yet that speaking in courtrooms required permission. I don't need a mansion. I just need somewhere I can plant tomatoes and not worry that somebody's going to make us leave before harvest. She looked directly at Judge Brennan, her small face serious as grief. Grandmother Elizabeth understood that. Mr. Coleman doesn't understand anything except wanting what he can't have. Evan stood next, whether from impulse or inspiration. Sarah couldn't determine his 6-year-old solemnity, somehow devastating in its earnestness. Grandmother left us books about rocks and plants. She knew I liked organizing things. Mr. Coleman doesn't even know my name. Judge Brennan's expression shifted microscopically. Something that might have been approval, or might have been the weariness of someone who'd seen enough human behavior to recognize truth when children spoke it plainly. He looked at Richard Coleman, then at Sarah, then at the 3 children who'd somehow taken control of a courtroom without realizing they'd done anything except told their truth. The judge's voice emerged measured and final. This court finds that Elizabeth Coleman possessed testamentary capacity at the time her will was executed. The evidence demonstrates clear intent, sound reasoning, and legitimate desire to provide for her son's children after years of forced separation. Blood relation extends through James Mitchell to his children, making them the direct descendants Mrs. Coleman named as beneficiaries. Richard Coleman's challenge is denied. The will stands as written. Miss Sarah Mitchell is confirmed as legal guardian and executor with full rights to the inherited property. The gavel came down with sound that finalized what had been uncertain made real. What had been contested transformed possession into ownership, in the space between one breath and the next. Sarah felt tears tracking down her face, unchecked. Felt Marcus's small hand find hers and squeeze tight enough to hurt. Felt Lillian's heaven pressing against her sides, seeking confirmation that this verdict meant what it sounded like it meant. Richard Coleman's face had gone red, his hands gripping the table edge with enough force to whiten his knuckles. He stood abruptly, chair scraping loud against floor, and his voice carried across the courtroom with venom, undisguised by courtesy or legal pretense. This isn't over. You think winning here means safety. You're squatting on Coleman land, and Colemans don't forget, don't forgive, and don't accept theft dressed as inheritance. Judge Brennan's gavel cracked again, sharp and authoritative. Mr. Coleman, you will refrain from threats or find yourself held in contempt. The ruling is final. Appeals may be filed through proper channels, but intimidation has no place in this courtroom or any interaction with the plaintiffs. Am I understood? Richard's attorney pulled him back down, whispered urgently in his ear, and the older man subsided into fury that radiated from him like heat from banked coals, not extinguished, merely contained temporarily until circumstances permitted release. 18 months passed before Sarah found the final envelope. The house was complete by then. solid warm with electricity from solar panels and water pipe from the spring. She was cleaning the train station's old office when she found the loose floorboard that opened differently than expected. Beneath it, a metal box, and inside two items that transformed understanding of everything. The first was a bundle of 50 letters, each written to James, but never sent, spanning from his 6th birthday to his death. Sarah read them with shaking hands. One entry written on James's wedding day: "Today, you married Sarah. I watched from the parking lot, saw how carefully you held her hand. You chose well, my son." Another 3 days after Marcus was born: "You have a son. He has your eyes, your serious expression. I pray you teach him better than George taught you, that cycles break when someone has courage to choose differently." Elizabeth had loved completely, had sacrificed everything, had watched her son's entire life unfold while forbidden from participating in it. The second envelope contained Elizabeth's final instructions. In safety, deposit box 512 was $150,000. Use it to establish a charitable fund, Elizabeth Coleman Family Hope Foundation. Help other families in situations like yours, was widows struggling alone, children at risk of homelessness, people who need chance but lack resources. This is how love multiplies, Elizabeth had written. Not through blood alone, but through choosing to extend to strangers the grace someone extended to you. 5 years after the court verdict, the foundation had helped 93 families. Marcus ran the financial operations. Lily designed the promotional materials. Evan maintained a database tracking outcomes. Sarah stood in the completed train station watching the annual gathering where families who'd been helped came together to share stories. Clay approached, handed Sarah a photograph, the completed house on the land garden, thriving children playing. "Elizabeth would be proud. You took what she gave and multiplied it past anything she probably imagined." Yes, Sarah thought about the letters, the years of watching, the calculated risk of leaving everything to a woman Elizabeth had never met. "She taught me that love doesn't require presence, just commitment to continuing the work of caring past the point where it's easy or convenient." Richard Coleman never bothered them again. The appeals he'd threatened never materialized. 6 months after the trial, he'd been arrested for fraud in an unrelated business deal. By the time he was released 3 years later, Sarah's family had become so integrated into the community, so visibly committed to helping others, that any renewed challenge would have faced not just legal opposition, but moral condemnation from everyone who knew their story. That night, back at the house on the land, Sarah gathered the children, teenagers now growing into the people Elizabeth had believed they could become. They sat on the porch overlooking garden and trees and the creek where Evan had found his stone years ago. "Tell us again about grandmother." Lily's request came softly ritual. They needed to remember where they came from and why they were choosing to live this way. Sarah pulled out one of the letters and read Elizabeth's words aloud, watched the children's faces as they processed the grandmother they'd never met, but knew intimately through actions that had shaped their entire lives. When she finished, Marcus spoke. "She gave us more than land and money. She gave us proof that choosing to love costs everything and matters anyway." Stars emerged as darkness claimed the sky. Evan pointed to a constellation he'd learned to identify. "That one. That's grandmother watching." Whether he meant it literally or metaphorically didn't matter. The sentiment was true regardless. Elizabeth watched through the lives she'd made possible, through the foundation that bore her name, through the children who carried her values forward into futures she'd never see, but had invested everything in creating. Sarah Mitchell sat surrounded by family on land that Elizabeth Coleman had purchased with careful planning and patient accumulation of resources, and she understood finally what the letters had been trying to communicate all along: that love persists past death when it's built into structures larger than single lifetimes. That real legacy isn't what you leave, but what continues growing after you're gone, that every choice to help instead of harm ripples outward in ways impossible to measure, but essential to make anyway.